Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we will complete um, our study of chapter 17 of the first book of Shmuel, of Samuel, and the famous victory of David over Goliath. V'haya, and this is verse 48, it's a long chapter. V'haya ki kam haplishti. And it was when the Philistine, Goliath, got up, stood strong, Vayelech, and he started running, or going, Vayikrav, Likrat David, and he got approaching to greet David in battle. Vayimaher David, and David, and immediately went quickly. So you see the difference between David, who is not wearing all this big armor, was able to use his speed, right, to take up a position from which he can attack Goliath, and Goliath was thus not able to reach him. Goliath was trying to come after him to Likrat David, to meet him in battle, but he couldn't catch him. Vayorotz, and Hamarachal Likrat Haplishti, and David ran to the line of battle, to the front, to the line in the sand where Israel was on one side and the Philistines on the other side. David ran towards it quickly in order to greet the Philistine. So he's running towards the Philistine while the Philistine is walking towards him, and you get the impression that the Philistine is unable to catch him. Vayishlach David et yado. Immediately David puts his hand, it seems to be while he's running, El HaKeli, into his pouch. Vayikach misham even. And he takes out, remember he had several stones in there, he took one out. Vayikala. And he put it in his slingshot and he slung it, at aiming directly towards the Philistine. Vayachet haplishti al mitzcho, and he slammed the rock right into the Philistine's forehead. And the Philistine, remember, is coming, and you get the impression he was coming downhill, and he's a huge person with a tremendous amount of weight of metal upon him. So this stuns him, knocks him in his head, and of course, vatitbah even b'mitzcho, the stone sunk into his forehead. Vayipol al panav arza, and he fell flat forward on the ground. So you'd think that being struck by the stone would have him fall backward, but actually, what David is doing is taking advantage of the fact that the Philistine is coming down from a higher place and coming with all this weight. And by knocking his forehead, it's not the force of the rock that knocked him over, but being stunned by the rock, he lost his footing, and because he was running forward to catch David, he fell forward and landed flat on his face. Immediately, now that he has him on the floor and he's immobilized, and David is quick, Vayechazak David min haplishti bakela. Thus, this is how David was stronger, beat out the Philistine with a slingshot, even with a stone. Vayachet haplishti, and then he struck the Philistine and killed him. So he must have either jumped on him or slammed him, either by kicking or punching or maybe stomping upon him. V'cherev ein biyad David. David did not even have a sword in his hand, because again that would have slowed him down. Vayaretz David, and then David ran. Vayamod el haplishti, and he stood over the Philistine. Vayikach et charbo, and he took the sword out of the Philistine's hand because he was immobilized on the ground. Vayishlafami ta'arav ayimosaseo, and he pulled it out of the Philistines, out of the sheath, and he killed him. Vayichras ba'ashosho, and he used the sword to chop off his head. Vayiru haplishtim ki meit giboram vayanusu. The Philistines saw that their powerful man, their hero, had been killed, vayanusu, and then they ran. Now what this does is, this accomplishes putting fear in the Philistines' hands. Remember, this was the Philistine appealing to his gods. David appealing to the God of Israel, saying, now the Philistines see, oh no, our gods are not going to fight for us. The God of the Israelites is so much more powerful and strong. It strikes fear into their hearts and creates havoc in the camp immediately, in the similar way that we've seen in the previous battle against the Philistines. Immediately the people of Israel see they have the upper hand. Vayakumu anshe Yisrael v'Yehuda, the people of Israel and Yehuda, again differentiating between the people of Israel and the people of Judah. So we see the split that's going to take place in several generations already had its origins. The other tribes and the tribe of Judah were already viewing themselves as separate, which was eventually going to lead to the split between Judah and Israel, which was going to be the two kingdoms, which we'll find later in history. But the seeds have been planted. Vayariu, and they started to cry out a battle cry. Vayirdefu et Aplishtim, and they chased the Philistines on Boach Gai until they got to a place called Gai, or this could mean until they got to a big valley. V'ad Share Ekron, and to the gates of a place of Ekron. Vayiplu Chalalei Philistim b'derech Sha'arayim, and they struck down many dead. Plishtim struck them dead b'derech Sha'arayim, on the road which goes to Sha'arayim, v'ad Gat, until the place of Gat, v'ad Ekron. Gat and Ekron both being cities, major cities in the Philistine kingdoms. Vayashuvu b'nei Yisrael midolok achrei Plishtim, and after they had struck down so many of them into their own homeland, they returned from their chase against the Philistines. Vayashosu es machneim, and they looted the camp that the Philistines had been in and took any items of value that they could out of there, and they won the battle. Vayikach David et Rota Plishti, David took the head of the Philistine, Vayivi'ehu Yerushalayim, and he brought it to Jerusalem. This is interesting because Jerusalem it was a far away from being an important place. It's not going to be for years until David comes to Jerusalem and makes Jerusalem his capital. We'll get there, but we got years to come until that happens. So presumably this is telling us what happened historically. David took the head of the Philistine, and eventually, later on, he brought it to Jerusalem. This was a trophy of a victory that really put David on the scene, so to speak. V'et kelev sam bi'ahalo, and he took the weapons that belonged to Goliath and put them in his tent as a symbol of his victory over Goliath, of Goliath. And now Saul v'chirot Shaul et David yotzei likrat haplishti, when Shaul saw David going out to meet the Philistine. Now this is going back a little bit. Before the actual victory, Shaul already saw what David was doing. He understood, as soon as he saw David going out, he understood what was going on. He got it. Yotzei likrat haplishti, when he saw him going, before he even beat the Philistine, when he went to greet him, Amar el Avner sar hatzavah, he turned to his general Avner and said, Ben mizeh, whose son is this Hanar? This young boy, whose son is he? Where does he come from, Avner? Now, Shaul had been introduced in the last chapter to David, and he was told that he was son of Yishai. It's possible that Shaul just didn't remember, because that wasn't an important point at that time. He was getting a guy who knows how to play the harp. So he wasn't paying attention to whose son he was. Now he wants to know, this kid is something special. I want to know who his family background is, whether or not he's appropriate to promote, right? But this Ben Mizeh, you get the sense that what Shaul is really asking is sometime when we call someone a son, we don't mean whose son physically, like who's the actual father of this man. But it means what kind of person, where does he come from? What's he like? Like, what's the deal? Vayomer Avner chei nafshecha hamelech im yadati. Avner said, I swear by your life, the king, if I know. In other words, I don't know, Your Majesty. I have no idea where he comes from. What's the deal with this guy? Vayomer hamelech she'al ato ben mizeh el ha'olem. I want you to ask, find out where he comes from, find out who his family is, this young man. An olem is the male version of alma, which is familiar. We know an alma generally refers to a young girl, and olem is a young man. So he's been called a na'ar, a young boy, and olem is a word that connotes even more youthfulness. Ucheshuv David mehakot et haplishti. And then later, when David came after he struck the Philistine down, Vayikachoto Avner took him Vayivi'eu lifnei Shaul and brought him before Saul. V'rosh haplishti biyado. At the time, David was holding the head of the Philistine. Vayomer elav Shaul ben mi'ato hanar. And Saul says to David, whose son are you, young man? Vayomer David, and David says, Ben Avducha, I am the son of your servant Yishai, Jesse Beis Halachmi from Bethlehem. This encounter here between David and Saul is the encounter right before we find the relationship between Saul and David going sour. Shaul at this point has the opportunity to promote David, to recognize him for his greatness, and more importantly, to learn from David the lesson that David was teaching him. Don't be afraid when you're confronted with a challenge like this. God is greater than that. How do you confront? With bravery, with courage, and by working hard, by thinking, planning, by never giving up. You don't give up. You don't back off in fear. When you're confronted by a challenge, you have to think, who is this man attacking me? How can I take him down? What are my strengths? What are his strengths? What are my weaknesses? What are his? How can I take advantage of his weaknesses and take advantage of my strengths and conquer him? Why do I have the strength to do that? Because I know that God is with me. Because I know that no matter what, God is with me. That is why I have to be humble before God and recognize that. This is the lesson that makes David so great, and that Saul, didn't get and didn't understand. But now he is starting to see this David is something special. This David is something different. Shaul now has a choice. Do I learn this lesson? Do I recognize it? And do I elevate David to a position of leadership and facilitate the transition between me and him? You also get the hint that Shaul by now might have already learned that Shmuel came to Yishai looking to anoint one of his sons as king. Shaul now already is starting to get an inkling that this might be the one who's going to take over. Shaul has the opportunity to do it. We will see, unfortunately, he makes a tragic choice to reject David, but that will come later. This concludes the story of David and Goliath, and how David defeated Goliath, and how David began his rise to stardom, so to speak. Thank you for studying chapter 17 together. Looking forward to studying chapter 18 and the rest of this book of Samuel together.